It's just after midnight, June 17th, 1972. A security guard named Frank Wills is making his rounds through an office and apartment complex in Washington, D.C., when he notices something small and strange, a piece of tape, stuck over a door latch to stop it from locking. He pulls it off. 20 minutes later, he finds another piece of tape on the same door put back by someone still inside the building. This time he calls the police. What officers find upstairs in the offices of the Democratic National Committee will not look at first like the event that ends a presidency. It looks like a burglary. 5 men in suits and rubber gloves, carrying cameras, listening devices, and thousands of dollars in cash with serial numbers that trace back to Nixon's own re-election campaign. Here's what almost nobody who repeats the Watergate story gets right. The break-in itself was almost a footnote. It was clumsy, it was caught within minutes, and standing alone, it probably wouldn't have brought down anyone. What destroyed a presidency wasn't the crime committed on June 17th. It was 2 years of decisions made after it, and most retellings, even serious ones, get the shape of that story wrong. This is the real timeline of Watergate, how it started, how it actually ended, and what even historians still get wrong about it. Part 1. The climate that made it possible. To understand why a sitting president's re-election campaign would order a break-in at the opposing party's headquarters, you have to understand the White House Richard Nixon was running by 1971. Nixon had come into office in January 1969 in the middle of a country tearing itself apart over Vietnam. By the early 1970s, the war was deeply unpopular, protests were constant, and Nixon and his closest aides had developed a siege mentality, a conviction that they were surrounded by enemies. The press, the anti-war movement, the Democratic establishment, even parts of their own government. That mentality produced its first major crime more than a year before Watergate. In 1971, a former defense analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked a classified Pentagon history of the Vietnam War, later known as the Pentagon Papers, to the New York Times. Furious and worried about what else Ellsberg might expose, the White House assembled a secret unit to plug leaks, nicknamed the Plumbers. That unit, run by a former CIA officer named E. Howard Hunt and a former FBI agent named G. Gordon Liddy, broke into the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist in Beverly Hills, hoping to dig up damaging material on him. It's a crime that gets far less attention than Watergate itself. But the same 2 men who planned it, using some of the same recruits, would go on to plan the DNC break-in less than a year later. By early 1972, Hunt and Liddy were both working for the Committee to re-elect the President, an organization whose acronym, CRP, critics gleefully shortened to CREEP. Liddy, CRP's general counsel, pitched an ambitious campaign of political espionage and sabotage against the Democrats, and after CRP's chairman and former U.S. Attorney General, John Mitchell approved a scaled-down version, roughly $250,000 in campaign funds was authorized to fund it. One target was the Democratic National Committee's headquarters, on the 6th floor of the Watergate office complex on the Potomac. In late May 1972, Hunt and Liddy's team broke in successfully, planting listening devices on DNC phones. But one of the bugs barely worked. So on the night of June 16th into the early morning of June 17th, 5 men went back in to fix it and photograph more documents. That's when Frank Wills found the tape on the door. Here's the detail almost every retelling flattens. It is still not definitively established, even today, whether Richard Nixon personally knew about or approved the DNC break-in in advance. What is established beyond any real dispute is that his campaign funded it. His former Attorney General authorized the operation that produced it, and within days of the arrests, Nixon was personally directing the cover-up. Part 2. The cover-up begins. The morning after the arrests, White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler dismissed the break-in as a third-rate burglary attempt. insisting the White House had no connection to it. Nixon himself would later announce publicly that he had conducted his own investigation and that no one on his staff was involved. Most of the country believed him. Behind the scenes, the story was different. Within days, White House counsel John Dean was coordinating a strategy to contain the fallout, and secret cash payments, sometimes called hush money, were funneled to the arrested burglars and their families to keep them quiet and encourage guilty pleas that would end the investigation quickly. On a recorded conversation in the Oval Office on June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-in, Nixon is heard approving a plan proposed by his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, to have the CIA falsely tell the FBI that continuing to investigate the break-in would compromise national security operations, an attempt to shut the FBI's investigation down using a false pretext. That recording would not become public for 2 more years, but it existed from day one. The strategy worked for a while. In January 1973, Liddy and one of the burglars, James McCord, were convicted. The other 4 burglars had already pleaded guilty. Nixon was re-elected in November 1972 in one of the largest landslides in American history, and for most Americans, Watergate looked like a closed, minor case. It started coming apart because of one man's letter. In March 1973, James McCord, facing sentencing, and increasingly convinced he was being set up to take the fall alone, wrote a letter to the trial judge, John Sirica, alleging that the burglars had been pressured to plead guilty and stay silent, and that higher-ups were involved. That letter, more than any single newspaper story, is what cracked the cover-up open. At the same time, 2 young Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, had been pulling on the same thread since the week of the break-in, aided by senior FBI official Mark Felt, a source they only ever identified publicly as Deep Throat, and whose real identity wasn't revealed until 2005. Their reporting kept the story alive in public through 1972, when almost no one else in the press was covering it seriously. By spring 1973, the dam broke. In April, Nixon's top aides Haldeman and Ehrlichman resigned, and White House counsel John Dean was fired. Dean would soon begin cooperating with prosecutors, testifying in detail about the cover-up. In May, the Senate established a special Watergate committee, chaired by Senator Sam Ervin, and its televised hearings became a national event, watched live by tens of millions of Americans through the summer of 1973. Part 3: The Tapes. The hearings produced the single most consequential revelation of the entire scandal, almost by accident. In July 1973, a former White House aide named Alexander Butterfield, testifying before the Senate committee, was asked an offhand question about the Oval Office's recording equipment, and confirmed something few people outside the White House knew. Nixon had installed a voice-activated tapping system that had recorded nearly every conversation in the Oval Office since 1971. From that moment, Watergate stopped being a question of who said what to whom and became a question of who could get the tapes. Special Prosecutor Archibald Cox subpoenaed them. Nixon refused, citing executive privilege, and offered a compromise where a friendly senator would summarize the tapes instead. Cox rejected the compromise. On the night of October 20, 1973, a night that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, Nixon ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson refused and resigned. Nixon then ordered Deputy Attorney General William Ruckelshaus to do it. Ruckelshaus also refused and resigned. Solicitor General Robert Bork, third in line, ultimately carried out the firing. The spectacle of a president firing his way through the Justice Department to kill an investigation into himself triggered a public and political backlash that, more than almost anything before it, turned Watergate from a Washington scandal into a full-blown constitutional crisis. Congress began drafting articles of impeachment within days. Nixon kept fighting to keep the tapes private for another 9 months. When one batch was finally released in late 1973, investigators discovered a mysterious 18.5-minute gap of erased audio on a key recording, never conclusively explained, and to this day, a subject of dispute over whether it was accidental or deliberate. The end came in July 1974. On July 24th, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in United States v. Nixon that executive privilege could not be used to withhold evidence in a criminal investigation and ordered the tapes released. Within days, the House Judiciary Committee approved 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. Then, on August 5th, came the recording that ended it, what became known as the smoking gun tape. It was that same June 23, 1972 conversation, recorded 6 days after the break-in, in which Nixon is heard directly approving the plan to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation. It was the first piece of evidence proving Nixon had personally participated in the cover-up from nearly the very beginning. The Republican senators who met with Nixon days later told him plainly that he had lost the votes to survive a Senate trial. On August 8th, Nixon announced his resignation on national television, and on August 9, 1974, he became the only U.S. president in history to resign the office. Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in that same day. 1 month later, on September 8th, Ford granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed as president, a decision that was, and remains, one of the most controversial in the history of the office. Part 4. What historians actually get wrong. Myth 1. Woodward and Bernstein's reporting is what brought down Nixon. This is the version of Watergate most people know, largely thanks to the book and film, All the President's Men, and historians who have studied the record closely, including some of Watergate's own leading historians, argue it substantially overstates the 2 reporters' role in the actual outcome. Woodward and Bernstein's reporting kept the story alive in the press through 1972, when few others were covering it, and that mattered. But what actually forced Nixon's resignation was the Senate Watergate Committee's televised hearings, Alexander Butterfield's disclosure of the tapping system, the Supreme Court's ruling in United States v. Nixon, and above all, the tapes themselves, evidence gathered through subpoena and testimony, not journalism. As one prominent Watergate historian put it, you needed that kind of corroborating evidence to actually prove the president's guilt. Reporting alone never would have been enough to remove him from office. Myth 2. It was just a break-in that spiraled out of control, a minor crime that Nixon panicked over. Woodward and Bernstein themselves have pushed back hard on this framing in later years, arguing that the phrase, "the cover-up was worse than the crime," has done real damage to public understanding. The break-in was one piece of a much broader campaign of political espionage and sabotage that Nixon's re-election operation ran against Democrats throughout 1972, and it followed on directly from an earlier related crime, the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, planned by the same operatives. The underlying pattern of abuse of power, historians like Stanley Cutler and later reporting by Woodward and Bernstein themselves have argued, was considerably broader and more serious than the single burglary that happens to give the scandal its name. Myth 3. We know for certain Nixon personally ordered the break-in in advance. Popular retellings often present this as settled fact. It isn't. What's well documented is that Nixon's campaign funded the operation, that his former Attorney General authorized a version of it, and that Nixon moved to obstruct the investigation within days of the arrests. But historians studying Nixon's private conversations and the surviving record have generally concluded that whether he had specific advance knowledge of the DNC break-in itself remains genuinely uncertain, a distinction that matters because the strongest, best documented case against Nixon was never really about the break-in. It was about the cover-up that followed it, for which the evidence, most of it in his own voice on his own tapes, is unambiguous. Myth 4. Deep Throat was the key to unraveling Watergate. Mark Felt, revealed as Deep Throat only in 2005, more than 3 decades after the events, has taken on an outsized, almost mythic role in popular memory, partly because of how dramatically his anonymity was maintained for so long. In reality, most historians regard his contribution as important but supplementary. He mainly helped confirm and contextualize reporting Woodward and Bernstein had gathered through other sources, rather than personally cracking the case. The investigation's true turning points, McCord's letter to Judge Sirica, Dean's cooperation with prosecutors, Butterfield's disclosure of the tapes, and the court's rulings, had little to do with Deep Throat at all. Nixon resigned, but he was never criminally tried or convicted. President Ford's blanket pardon closed that door a month after Nixon left office. Several of his top aides, including Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Mitchell, did serve prison time. Nixon himself faced no criminal consequences for the conduct captured on his own tapes.